Please welcome the Director of GCHQ, Anne Keast-Butler, and former US National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon session. And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce and to moderate a discussion with Director Anne Keast-Butler. Anne is the 17th Director of the UK's Government Communications Headquarters kind of component, otherwise known as GCHQ. That goes back to, what, 1919?
Yeah.
It was a very long string of expertise, considerably longer than what the United States has been doing. That's the UK organization, of course, that's responsible for signals intelligence, information assurance, and cryptography, all in support of a mission that is known, I think, simply and profoundly as Keep the UK Safe. As the director, Anne also serves as a permanent secretary. I think in private sector parlance that would be a CEO, reporting to the UK's Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, a little bit different than the United States, where NSA, its component, its equivalent here, is lodged in the Department of Defense. For us, this would be lodging it in the State Department. And she's also a member of the UK's National Security Council and a cabinet official on what's known as the Joint Intelligence Committee. Anne herself brings 30 years of experience, national security experience, to the job. She had previous service at the domestic security agency known as MI5. She was the Deputy Director General there, responsible for kind of operational, investigative, and domestic security threats. Previous to that, she was the Director General for Strategy. And earlier in her career, she spent 2 years in a secondment to GCHQ, where she led the intelligence support to counterterrorism and serious organized crime. She has a maths degree from Merton College at Oxford, and we're just so delighted to welcome you here. I understand this is your first RSA.
It is, Chris, yeah.
So far, so excellent?
Excellent, and really great to get that sense of community, of people all working together to keep our citizens safe.
It is extraordinary. So I think this is a session that substantively is going to be quite valuable. But I also find what happens on the fringes, on the margins, so much more valuable as well. You meet kind of 300 of your closest friends and 5,000 others. And you wind up being informed and smart about things in a way that you couldn't in a month of Sundays. So let's start the discussion. You're well into your second year as the director of GCHQ, and I would kind of observe, you may or may not agree with me, we're in a world that's experiencing the consequences of inherent fragility in just about all the components of the operating systems that serve us. That includes the climate, domestic and geopolitics, critical infrastructure, key among them. But they all depend on digital infrastructure. And given your role and responsibility within the UK to focus on that, the lens that you have is that, but everything depends upon that. How are we doing? Right? So where are we in terms of the state of play?
So I think it's a really mixed picture, and that's partly why it's fantastic to be here amongst so many people, Chris, who see it as their mission and their responsibility to secure that digital infrastructure. I think there's lots of really good work going on. There's a much greater awareness of the vulnerabilities, whether that is through sort of malicious cyber intent or accident or fragility in systems. But we're in a world in which technology is developing fast. The adversaries are as innovative and not bound by some of the constraints as those of us who are defending are. And so one thing we're really paying attention to, and it features in our National Cybersecurity Centre's annual report, is that gap between our ability to defend and the vulnerabilities of that interconnected world.
Right. And so when you think about what it is you have to defend, what are the core assets? What are the things you say, this is at the center of this problem? This is what is to be defended. What does it mean to keep the UK safe?
So I think it's a really good question because it has a number of different lenses. I mean, at the heart of the things that we want to defend is a sort of slightly all-embracing term of the critical national infrastructure. And when that term was first around, it was things like power stations and water towers and food supply chains. All of that is still really critical national infrastructure, but we are seeing increasingly, the data center, the digital ecosystem be much more part of that, and that is at the heart of what we try to defend. We're also working really closely with other partners in government and elsewhere to look at how you can support individual citizens defend themselves, and how you how you support the economy remain secure and robust and a safe place to work.
And what's the performance goal? When do you know that you've succeeded?
I mean, I don't think you ever succeed. I think this is a constant work in progress. I mean, governments through the ages in all nations have that responsibility to defend their citizens. And the world changes, so what you have to defend against changes. If we ever thought we would get there, I mean, we'd all be out of jobs for a start, and that wouldn't help any of us. But so that striving to be better, to keep closing the gap, to keep pace with technology is something that I think is at the heart of everyone's mission.
So I like the heart of that answer, which is that we want this to meet our expectations. If you depend upon critical infrastructure for something, you want it to meet those expectations under all reasonably foreseeable conditions. What are those threats?
I mean, the threats are manifest, and some of the solutions, I think, are threat agnostic. So, at the moment, the biggest cyber threat actually comes from ransomware, and that can be small, cheap to execute, accelerated by some of the sort of latest technologies around AI, and have really significant impacts. You've seen that here in the US, most recently in the health sector. We see that all the time in the UK. And if you can defend against that, then you're also starting to hardwire in some of the basic fundamentals that prevent you from being vulnerable to more sophisticated state threats. And of course, in the contested geopolitical world that we're living in, those state threats are very real, and things that we're paying a lot of attention to.
So there's an old joke in the United States about a bacon and egg breakfast where they say that the chicken is involved and the pig is committed. I'll explain that more after the talk. But in this regard, that's my question. Who's involved and who's committed, right? Who has to actually play in this activity to ensure that you meet your objectives of keeping the UK safe in a world that is under constant threat from all those players?
So the thing that is really clear to me is that no one pig, chicken, whichever creature can do this on their own. And so the challenge is to make sure everyone is committed and everyone is involved. And by that, I mean, government definitely has a part to play. And different governments will decide exactly what that part is, but there is a convening part, there is a regulation setting, there's a standard setting sort of role for government. But a lot of the insights and the ability to design in security at the start is in industry. And that is really important that we therefore partner together. A lot of the research about where vulnerabilities will be, about how technology might be used, about what has impact in closing gaps and things is in academia. So we have to pull in that really cutting edge research. And then of course citizens have a part to play. They've got to be demanding of these services. They've got to want to take the measures. Some of it comes with an added complexity for them, multi-factor authentication, for example. It's an extra click or two.
Right.
You need to want that and to be prepared to do it because you see the personal consequences. So for me, bringing all those components together, finding language that binds them in, that crosses geographical boundaries, because of course cyber has no geographical boundaries, and lets us partner cleverly together internationally. That's going to be at the heart of our success. And I think we do that really well in some places. And I'm really proud that the National Cyber Security Centre in the UK is part of GCHQ, because that has been at the cutting edge of that industry-government exchange.
So let's talk about that. That's an excellent lead into what I think is the second theme, which is I've long admired the UK's leadership in the realm of fostering collaboration. In this space, you've given a masterclass time and time again. I watched with envy what you did in 2016 in terms of creating the National Cybersecurity Center. And we in the United States have worked hard to try to emulate, if not replicate that. The Bletchley Park Initiative more recently, where you brought together a coalition of global leaders to consider what we wanted to get from artificial intelligence. How do we make it serve our needs, the resilience and robustness of that? So with all of that taken in hand, help us in this masterclass. What are the tenets that underpin your work in fostering collaboration? How do you think about that?
So there's something really strong for me about community, about how do you create a community, an international community, a diverse community, a community that brings together the best of industry, academia, citizens, government, and allows them to work together, not compete, and to have really good, honest exchanges, and to do that in a way that is accessible. So it's no good us having insights into threat if we can't communicate them clearly, make sure they reach CISOs in industry, get into boardrooms, are adaptable and absorbable and relevant to how businesses might want to use them. So for me, that building a community that can talk to each other, that trusts each other, that is prepared to share potentially, embarrassing or difficult information.
So any secrets, not the classic kind, but any secrets as to how you actually create that environment? We're familiar with so many deep and sharp capabilities that find it hard to actually arraign themselves in a way that they're trying to achieve a shared objective, to collaborate in the old-fashioned way where they have a degree of professional intimacy that they can finish each other's sentences. That's just wicked hard. So how do you set that up?
And one of the things I would observe is that human relationships are really key. So, coming together as people are doing here, your point about what you learn in the margins, the people that you see, the ideas you get, that really matters.
Right.
So creating spaces where people can come together. And the UK probably has that advantage over the US just in terms of size and, distance that people have to travel to come together. So that for me is thing one. Thing two is creating that really shared sense of mission, of purpose, of why you would be in the room in the first place, of why it matters to you. And I think we've got some work to do on that. One of the Cyber Essentials capabilities that we roll out as National Cybersecurity Centre, we know that when small firms take that up, they are significantly less likely to be vulnerable to a ransomware attack. And yet, only a fraction of firms take it up. And so how do we reach everyone else? How do we make it everybody's shared ambition to play their part? And I think that is, for me, that is a work in progress. And then the third thing is, how do we incentivize it? So regulation, legislation, they all have their part to play, but they are a bit of the stick. And so how do you create a carrot? How do you get a competitive advantage by having this? How do we incentivize the market? Those are things that we see work and we want to make work more.
That's excellent. So if I studied this properly, kind of watching the NCSC and other kind of activities there work, you've positioned GCHQ and the NCSC as a leading element of that on the information assurance side, to be a convener, to be a venue, to be a subject matter expert about the things that GCHQ can be expected to know better than anyone else. If I got that right, and if so, how do you actually deliver that consistently day after day after day? And what do you expect the people who show up on that floor from the private sector, what do they bring?
So that is broadly where we're trying to be, and that sort of how do we act as a sensible interface and national technical authority where we bring that expertise. So what really matters to us is continuous investment in our own learning and skills. And that is quite hard sometimes when you're in the public sector to attract the best talent because you don't pay the same as industry.
What?
I know, shocking. But the way
you have
that
free parking.
Please don't talk about parking. No one in the intelligence community should talk about parking. But we have a really powerful mission. And so where people are at that point in their career where they want to make a difference, then sometimes being able to come and work for us gives you unique ability to make a difference. And so that skills and talent really matters. Innovating really matters. So we try and position our responsibility to do the things that government can pioneer, can pilot, can support, can research, innovate, and we need to be at the cutting edge of that. And that partly answers what do we need industry to bring.
Right.
We need industry to bring its cutting edge ideas, its thoughts, its ability to kind of pilot, pathfind, cut through stuff and help meet us halfway in our sort of needs.
And possibly some compelling expectations.
Yeah,
Right, so.
yeah. And then the other thing that I think is really important is that there was once a time, I think, where government felt it had the secrets, it knew them, it held them like this, and it might sort of drip them out to other people. I mean, those days are long gone, aren't they? The people who really understand how the internet is being used, what data is flowing where, where malware is appearing, what vulnerabilities are being exploited are in industry. What we bring from government is some insights into people's intent, or a little bit of the picture that when you wash against what industry knows, makes something more understandable. And so we're also wanting for that to be a much more open, shared conversation.
So I run the risk of framing this as a private-public collaboration constrained to the UK. Of course, there's a much broader coalition here.
Yeah.
The Five Eyes is the natural kind of first resort to expand that. But the international coalition is far bigger than that. Can you comment on what's being done to actually make it such that it's just not a government to a private sector, but it's governments plural to private sector, which actually ruthlessly runs across those boundaries?
I mean, it has to run across those boundaries, otherwise it doesn't work. And your point that, the Five Eyes is at the heart of it, because that is a really strong, trusted alliance of people who have grown up together, worked together is right. But if it is just the Five Eyes, then it doesn't bring in huge chunks of the population and feeling kind of connected to the advice or that it's relevant to them. So, I mean, it's just part of how we work, is to make sure where we're calling out bad behaviour, we're doing that in a co-signed way with as many nations as possible. We recently did something with Five Eyes in Germany on spyware, to help people understand how particular capabilities were being used against the Uyghur community, and to give people advice on that. We try and do as far-reaching advisories as possible, because we know that they will be as far-reaching, and that's what we want to do. Is we want to connect.
So you said a moment ago that the secret sauce for the government's contribution, GCHQ and its counterpart NSA and others like them, might no longer be kind of a deep secret that they alone have. So what more can the government put on the table? What more can the government contribute to that?
So I think we do, just to reassure, we do still have some deep secrets. And,
There's
we are...
natural aid streaming in.
I was going to say, we do still have elements that are not visible to industry, so we can absolutely bring that. I think we can bring also that real responsibility to keep our nations and our citizens safe, and to be therefore prioritising where we think taking action will have impact. And I think we have a duty to make sure that everybody, every business, every board is paying attention to their own resilience, their own organisation's resilience, because we know our citizens depend on it. And so demanding that, being a really active demandeur, matters. And of course, we've got to look after ourselves too. Government's data, government's information, government services that millions of people rely on. We need to be role models of the resilience and the expertise that we're expecting from others.
I particularly like the middle of that alliteration that you went through, which is the source of unimpeachable guidance. I admit that I have actually read the password guidance document that you printed. It might not be the most scintillating thing I've ever read, but it is one of the most valuable things I've ever read. And I've read your reports on how to think about the use of generative AI. We'll get to that later. What are the defenders doing? What are the attackers doing? And so I imagine that that's a useful, if not unique, source of information for those who say, I just need some guidance, and I don't know that I'm being sold a product or a service, when what I really want is just guidance.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, and therefore it goes back to why I care a lot about the right skills and the right people in my organisation, because for you to feel confident in reading that guidance, it's got to be written as if it works for you. My mum's got to be able to read it and understand it when she wants to look at her passwords.
Right.
And so making sure we've got that depth of skills, both the technical, but then also the ability to communicate it, really matters.
And closing out this section on collaboration, can you say a little bit more? I think you still call it the NCSC 100, the group of companies that show up. I found that to be unique and novel and inspiring. So say a little bit about what you do there.
Well, what we did there, I mean, it was in answer to one of your earlier questions, Chris, actually, about how do you build this partnership, is we thought, well, we won't do it, virtually, we won't do it in theory, we're going to need to do it by doing stuff together. And so we looked at how we could bring in people who are working in industry, who keep their jobs working in industry, who spend a day or two a week with us, and that is a shared collaboration, and they have access to our information and our systems, and they come into our building. A bit less so now post-COVID, where people work more remotely and we're more able to connect to them. But it has been a really good way of learning together and taking a sort of theoretical conversation and making it practical. And we work on problems of mutual interest and agree those and work through them. And it is a really good thing. I want to build on it.
Yeah, I remember in a previous job that I had, somebody who spent hundreds of millions of dollars through his company on cyber every year came in and asked me if I had any idea what was critical in the sector that he worked in. I had to admit that I could describe it in broad terms, big hand, little map. But I couldn't say with precision that this component or that piece was the critical piece that we needed to focus on. He said, you're right. He said, if you're in pursuit of automobile safety, you might focus on the tailpipe, not knowing that there are other components that are far more essential to the safety of that car. I saw that actually manifestly done at the NCSC. I think it's a really well done activity.
Thank you.
Let's turn to resilience by design or security by design, depending upon how you use the English language. UK has been a really strong supporter of this. The US has attempted to follow suit on that. I think even as recently as yesterday here, the director of the Department of Homeland Security in her remarks yesterday said that building in security is important. But how's it going? Because the systems that need the resilience downstream that are placed in the hands of the users, the operators, still don't seem to have that. It still doesn't seem to be built to be defended.
So I think there are some really good examples where it's going well, and that should give us confidence for the future. And some of the work that we do, including with companies that are represented here, there is appetite and interest to learn together, to improve design, to make sure that things you learn from working with the national security community you put out into your global products, and we're strengthening all the time. And that is partly because it's the right thing to do, and it's partly because customers are demanding it. So for me, there are some real strengths. I think the thing that we all have to pay attention to, and I know it's been a big theme of lots of the sort of sessions here, is how do we hardwire that in when we are in an arms race to be at the frontier of some of the emerging technologies. So it's really important as we develop these new technologies and think about how people are scaling up use of AI in all of their products and their ways of working, for example, that we don't forget the fundamental security of the data that underpins it, the models that underpin it, the weightings, the information that is in those systems. And that's where I want to make sure that we don't, in rushing to be out there ahead of others, we forget that it's no good winning if you leave destruction behind you. You've got to do this securely together.
So how do you get the balance right? I have to admit that in the US, we sometimes focus kind of on the things that we can as opposed to the things we must. I'll give an example, my own personal view, not necessarily an official view of anyone in the room or in the government. But the Securities Exchange Commission, when it focused on publicly traded companies and said you have 4 days from the awareness of something called a material incident to report that, which I think was flawed, maybe nobly intended, but flawed in two regards. One, you're now exposing a vulnerability that you possibly haven't fixed, or that your adjacent partners have, and they weren't even aware of it until it became a race between the attackers and the defenders. But more importantly, you're focused on the wrong end of the supply chain, where the people who are attempting to defend these things have received something that's not made to be defended.
Yeah. And
they're up against nation states or criminal ransom kind of ware gangs who have the effect of nation states. So how do you get that balance right?
So I think partnership is at the heart of this too. If you co-create the solution for the outcome that you know you will want, then you're much more likely for it not to have unintended consequences. And so if you can get a shared enough commitment to designing products that are safe for the citizens, that are not going to be vulnerable for companies, that are not going to floor a sort of supply chain and leave something exposed, then you can agree how you're going to do that. And you might spot earlier that a measure like that will have unforeseen consequences. And you can look then at how do we incentivize the market to do the design at the beginning, At what point do we share the information? How do you make sure that sharing the information leads to the right outcome rather than the wrong one? And given that cybersecurity, however good we are not going to be able to stop every attack. How do you also incentivize the preparedness for recovery? And so one of the things that I would encourage anyone who has a position on a governance, in an organization, sits on a board, is have you tested what happens when you get done over? Have you really practiced that? Because however good you are, it may well happen. And the more you have practiced it, the quicker you can respond and the better your recovery and the less the damage. And so for me, that preparedness and responsiveness is as an important part of the really transforming your resilience.
So I think you've answered this next question across the various mechanisms you've identified, but maybe kind of focus in on a little bit. You talked about serving the needs of the citizens and the perhaps businesses and the consortia that are at the end of that supply chain. How do you get their kind of aspirations, expectations, statements of this is what I need? This is the property of what I want in this system.
So I think there are three key ingredients for that, Chris. I mean, first is that really clear advice. So when somebody says, what can I do? You don't give a sort of generic or pay attention to your cybersecurity. You have sensible measures. So I would be saying, are you discussing this risk at your board? Are you using some of the some of the sort of advice we give on readiness to really test it? Have you looked at your skills gap? Do you know what your supply chain is? Practical things like that give people real concrete stuff they can test themselves against. And we have benchmarks and all of that sort of toolkit that you would expect. So that for me is it's a really important ingredient. There is then something about, if you think government is going to succeed in reaching everyone, we're on a losing wicket. Sorry, a cricket reference. I should use an American. I'm not quite sure where we're not going to win. And so can everybody...
We typically don't win wickets.
Yes, many days of not winning. So it needs to be everybody's responsibility to be pushing that out. And really, again, that goes back to the community of everybody raising awareness.
Well, that tees up a really nice framing, I think, of what you've offered is, we talked a little bit about the technology, we'll talk more later. You've now talked about the assignment of roles, responsibilities, expectations, what kind of in the world I come from we used to call doctrine, but it's really important. And you've talked about the skills. You need to align those three. How do you think you've been able to do that in the UK? Have you been successful in saying everybody's involved? There's a role for kind of expectations laid upon everyone's shoulders. The skills are in the right place, the technology is in the right place. Do we have the right alignment of those three pieces? Because any system of interest is comprised of those three things.
So it's probably like my earlier answer of thinking that this is always going to be a work in progress. So are boards and companies more aware of their risk? Absolutely. And I'm very much of a never miss the opportunity of a crisis to raise awareness. So we're getting plenty of opportunities to raise awareness globally of why this matters. So it's in a better place than it was perhaps when I was first launching the UK's first national cybersecurity strategy 15 years ago. There's much greater awareness. Digital skills, I mean, there is a much greater take up of the right sort of skills, but you will all know that we still have huge vacancies in the cybersecurity jobs market. And so have we got the skills right? Not yet. Can AI help us on that? I'm sure it can. So how do we automate some of this through the latest technology so that skills gap becomes a little bit less important? And then can we all afford it? I mean,
let's talk about that.
That is tricky.
So who pays? I mean, there's certainly a time and attention cost, and maybe there's a focus, right, an opportunity cost that comes from focusing on this rather than that. But there's a pound sterling cost.
Yeah.
Who pays that bill?
At the moment, the risk is that the individual citizen ends up picking up the tab, and businesses go out of business, and people lose their jobs, and that is where we're paying for it. I mean, we're paying for it now by not doing it. So how do we...
And is that recognized? I mean, do people say that is a cost that we collectively bear, or it's one of those things that's lost in the noise?
Well, I mean, my sense is it's often lost in the noise, and more so on cyber than it perhaps is in physical losses. I don't know if that is your sense here too.
What's my sense? There's a classic question that's asked often here, which is, do we need a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor for those who can remember those events? And my answer to that is that we're actually experiencing it right now.
Yeah.
It's just diffused in time and space. We haven't seen it for what it is. It hasn't appeared on some television screen that we all looked at and said, that's me. I'm involved in this. And so we can imagine that what happened well to the right of me, well to the left of me, does not implicate me.
Yeah.
That's a challenge. That's a problem.
Well, and also I think it is one of those costs where it feels sort of free on the point of use. So I'm looking at some of the recent ransomware attacks we've had in the UK, and the data suggests that in one of those, the loss to the company for being out of action for a few months was 8 times the amount of profit it had made that year. But it won't appear like that in the books, and it won't appear like that. So I think it is a really hard thing, and it's why getting the security right by design at the beginning, incentivizing the market so that this cost is A, born when it's cheaper, because it's always much cheaper to build it in than it is to fix it or to pick up the cost of it going wrong.
Right. It's a really good point. I'm a year out of date in terms of looking at any statistics of this sort, but I recall looking at one that first started with the premise that most businesses in the United States are small businesses, 25 employees or less. There's a significant portion of those that experience a cyber attack on an annual basis. Yeah. And of those, a significant portion, those who have suffered a cyber attack, go out of business. And in no small way attributable to the fact that that was just the fatal blow. Right? They couldn't do that and all the other things they had to do.
And I was going to say one of the stats I've seen is that about 60% of those businesses who are vulnerable to or suffer a ransomware attack, that about 60% of those attacks could have been avoided with simple multi-factor authentication. So that is not a big cost to have put it up front.
That's particularly true here. There's a lot of kind of sincere and kind of true regret, meaning I knew I should have done it, but I was busy. I had other things to do. Turning to perhaps a slightly broader horizon, kind of the international diaspora, the European Union, UK, US, other national entities who operate in the international space, they seem at the moment to be on different paths in how they would reconcile choices about how to defend or to deploy cyber power. The EU clearly concerned about resilience, defensive privacy, prone to regulate. The UK focused on mobilizing a coalition to promote resilience by design, operational collaboration. The US revisiting the alignment between cyber offense and cyber defense. What's your take on that? Are those kind of departing, are they diverging in a way that's unhelpful? Is that actually a diversity that can converge to be a strength? Because the companies who work across those lanes, they want some degree of consistency, they want harmonization. And so what's your view about how we actually deliver to those companies a world in which they can operate with some consistent compass about what's expected and why?
So that call for consistency and alignment is one that I hear all the time, and I really understand where it comes from. But I also, I'm really mindful that if we spend all of our time trying to align different nations and governments who've been elected by different populations to do the same thing, we're probably wasting precious time to actually do something. And so what I'm really interested in is how do we co-create, clear standards and guardrails that allow companies to have that consistency, but also allow different nations to set their own ambition and their own
Is that a performance-based approach as opposed to a standards or a scripted approach?
So I think it's a bit of both. I mean, it's a performance. It's about minimal service levels that you would expect to be built
into. But they can determine the mechanism by which they do that.
Yeah. And I think that is a more, and some incentives that apply whatever jurisdiction you're working in. And I think that is probably going to give us a greater return on our investment than wishing politicians would all behave the same, because that's just not going to happen.
And the possibility of reciprocity, meaning that if the EU says this is fine, the UK will say that's fine for us too. That might be another way to get to it.
Yeah, and just, again, talking and sharing with each other, why does this work for you? How can we learn from you? What's the impact that has had? therefore it's worth doing. And so that sort of open conversation about what is making a difference, and really being able to measure that. And you can't do that on your own. You've got to do that by talking and building those coalitions. And national security is one of those areas where, as you well know, alliances and coalitions are what lets us be more than the sum of our parts, lets us defend ourselves, our nations, our allies' nations really strongly together. And that for me is a sort of shared goal and gives us grounds for moving towards greater alignment. But I think people will always have different choices over exactly what they prioritise in their own national agenda, and that's a good thing because we can learn from each other.
I think it can be. So let me give a case in point, but genericized, kind of no names. Say an international company that does business in many places, but in the United Kingdom, they suffer some sort of significant cyber attack, and they show up at the NCSC's door. What will you do for them, and how do you then connect into your counterparts in other nations to ensure that that company is getting the benefit of a larger coalition, and that they're not going to have to report to 16 different doors to get 16 different answers, some of whom punitively punish them, some of whom help them? How do we deliver to that company something that actually begins to equate to coherence?
I mean, I don't think there is a generic answer because...
I apologize for laying that at your doorstep.
No. I don't think there is a single answer because all of these cases are slightly different. The key thing for me is to understand what the level of damage is, where that damage is going to be felt most, who your big stakeholders are, and then, like any problem, to get those people into a room and agree what your course of action is going to be together, so that you're not having 16 courses of actions. You're looking at who is the best athlete to support this victim, what are the minimum legal requirements that are going to have to be met in different nations, and how do we try and satisfy as many of those with one set of activities, who's in the lead, what individual roles people have. But you can't do that if you haven't built the trust when things are going well. So that, for me, is part of the effort that NCSC colleagues put into international partnerships, getting to know people, having the right relationships. Because when things go wrong, as you know, it is much easier to work through the solutions if you know each other, if you know who to phone, if you trust the person that you're in a dark room with.
That may in part answer the next question, which is, so what advice would you give to a private sector international company that works across these borders, of how can they exercise their influence before the event? Kind of come to you and say, this is what's useful to me, this is what I need in terms of harmonization, simplicity, but what's the venue for that? How can they do that?
So in the UK, we have these really powerful, well-established structures called our information exchanges. We run them in individual sectors. We work really closely with the government departments that lead on that sector, and those are exactly the sort of place that we encourage people to come in, get to know the community, get to know the right sort of people, and if they want to have a conversation in the margins, to use that to build that sort of trust. So I would just encourage people to engage with those, to look for the ones most relevant in their sector. And if you're present in a number of different countries, you're going to want that in each country because you don't know where you're going to get hit. And if you've only invested in the UK and you get taken out in Spain, it's not going to be the most useful relationship. So that there is just something about looking at where your infrastructure, your investment is, and making sure that you're well positioned in that country, because that will then help you wherever you are, wherever you're vulnerable.
I imagine that helps you find where your interests intersect. I was in a discussion yesterday, listening to a discussion yesterday, which thoughtfully kind of replayed where the United States has been for so many years, which is 16 critical sectors. Anything in any one of those critical sectors is by definition critical. You all of a sudden have, all God's creatures have kind of an equal degree of criticality. But of course that's not true. No. Right? To run an economy, you might kind of pull that thread horizontally and say, I need a certain amount of telecommunications, electricity, so on and so forth. When you really get down to brass tacks of where the critical points are, they're fewer in number. How do you do that in the UK to determine this is really where we should bias, this is our priority? This is number one, maybe not number one, but this is in the first cluster. Yeah. This is in the last.
So the way we do it in the UK is we have those sectors very similar sectors. I mean, we're constantly looking at whether they're the right sectors or whether the right things are in the right sectors, because the world is changing, as we talked about at the beginning. Each sector has a departmental lead, so they're responsible for the overall health.
And where's that person?
So that person is in the government department that best represents the
Gotcha.
sector. So energy would be in our department for energy and net zero.
Okay.
Digital would be sitting in our department for science, innovation, technology. Health is with health, etc. So the sort of the department closest to the sector looks at the overall resilience of that sector and is responsible for their kind of critical national infrastructure within it. We then have multiple forums, which National Cyber Security Centre and also our national MPIA, that looks after the sort of physical and personnel security, will have leads into each sector. And we look at where is the vulnerability greatest, where is the need for government intervention the greatest. Those two things are not always the same. Some sectors are very good at managing themselves because the incentives are there for them to do so. So, government's role is more to mark homework than to hold hands to do the homework, if that makes sense. And then also, where would the impact be felt most?
Right.
And that kind of careful balance is looked at on an annual cycle with checks all the way through, and that will call out, for us, particular focus on energy at the moment, telecommunications, and then some of the sort of supply chain
Is
stuff.
there a venue, a place, an organization where all those strands come together?
So they are pulled together in the Cabinet Office for us, so in a cross-government way. I mean, I'm not quite sure what your equivalent is here, but the expertise on cybersecurity sits in NCSC. So we are listened to, and we will be making recommendations of, we think we should be putting our highest priority effort onto this sector, and in this way. There's an opportunity to challenge us in case we're just doing the things that are easy rather than things we should.
Right.
But it's a
And because of the process you described, the private sector is, by definition, represented in that
Yeah.
process.
And we get their views through those information exchanges that I mentioned, so their voice is heard. We bring their views in
Wow.
too.
It wouldn't be RSA if we didn't talk about transformative technologies. And so let's go into that corner. Of course, generative AI has stalked the land for the last 2.5 years. Quantum computing might be close behind, depending upon what your time scale is. Are those, in the world you live in, are those boon or bane? Is that a feature, or is that something that's challenging us?
I don't think the world is ever quite as binary as that, is there?
Right.
There is always a really exciting opportunity with technology, and there is always very sobering risk and challenge. And I don't think anyone would be in this world if they weren't excited by the opportunities from technology.
So I read a really interesting report. It's about 1.5 years ago now, might be slightly longer, but I think it was about a year after generative AI burst on the scene. And it was in NCSC, one of kind of an organization under your leadership's reports. And it actually compared and contrasted how the defense is making use of generative AI and how the offense is making use of generative AI. Not a great surprise, the offense is about a year ahead.
It's faster, yeah.
And why is that? It's not your responsibility for that, but you actually kind of shone a bright light on it. Why is that?
Why is that? I mean, it's often easier to go on the offence, isn't it? And particularly the people who want to go on the offence, they don't have quite the same rules. They're not really worried about the risk in the same way. And they're experimenting and kind of, setting the pace. What I think, and talking to various people here, I see some real energy and exciting offers that I think are going to come out from AI and cyber defensive space. I mean, AI is really good at coding. It should help us get rid of some of those bugs right from the outset, so they're not even there. And then it ought to be probably better than humans at spotting anomalies and running patches and things like that. So I'm really optimistic that the defensive will catch up. But I think inevitably on the defensive side, we don't want to accidentally be offensive by defending.
Right.
So we have to be much more cautious, and that just takes time.
But not to catch you out, when you say that they'll eventually catch up, do you mean that defense will eventually use the same tools in a defensive posture that the offense is using, or they'll operate at the same speed?
They'll operate at the same speed.
Excellent.
And I think it will really help with that hardwiring and security by design, because we can do that faster and at
And you touched
scale.
on this briefly, but this goes back to the Bletchley Park Declaration. How do we make the necessary investments? This is kind of a value statement on my part, with apologies, but how do we make the necessary investments in that transformative technology to ensure that it meets our expectations under all conditions?
Yeah.
For the third leg under a stool that for so long has had innovation and market efficiency, but too seldom do we put resilience or safety under that.
Well, I think there is an element, Bletchley Park in a sort of war situation, often people look to government to sort of bail the nation out. You know, that's not where we are on this. This has got to be a shared endeavour, and the investment that everybody is making into this technology. I mean, it's what industry is making, private sector is making into the technology is dwarfs what government is spending. Mm-hmm. And so, how do we? I think the challenge for us is to make sure that we are valuing the resilience. And that's where, you know, we have opportunities to learn by what goes wrong, because we can show business that if they're not thinking about that in the sort of supply chain of their own efforts, right, then they are vulnerable, and therefore it starts to show why you've got to pay attention to it, why you've got to make the investment. And we're hosting Cyber UK in Manchester in the UK next week, and our whole theme is on transforming resilience, and it's trying to get some of this shared effort, that this exciting technology and the way that we can partner together can have a really transformative effect if we unlock it sensibly and together. So that will be my challenge to everybody in Cyber UK, is what can you do from your role in your company or your research lab to really think about strengthening resilience. And I guess it's a challenge I'd love to put out here as well, because there's no good being resilient in one country in this interconnected world. We need our countries to be resilient together.
That's a fair charge. And I think, you know, I have kind of led this down the road of the technology, but of course the technology is built to serve the human. Yeah. The human remains in the system. Can you talk a little bit about what we have to do to get the humans prepared for this, especially for the speed of these changes? I mean, generative AI is now on its 5th iteration since it first came in, and no one who understood it then could understand what its actual potential and capability is at the moment. So how do we prepare the human for that?
So I think, I mean, I have a slightly biased view, because I am mainly hanging out with humans who are really interested in this technology.
Me too.
And therefore I see people are doing this for themselves, and actually the state trying to do it would be a bit nannying. And you know, I look at my kids who are young adults and who are just living with this sort of technology as native speakers. And that gives me real cause for optimism, because I think they are ready. I think where states and governments and organisations like mine play a part is in making sure that that doesn't lead to digital inequity and the haves and the have-nots. And you know, we need to be really thoughtful about who will get missed out on that journey and what additional outreach or support they are going to need. Right. And then how do we put that emphasis not just on them to be ready, but on products and services and capabilities that have a really strong user interface for different skill sets.
Excellent. I know we have just a couple of minutes, and I want to leave the last words to you. So if I could cede that. You've been doing quite a lot of travel lately. Here you are at your first RSA conference. You're kind of cheek by jowl up against the American side of the Five Eyes relationship. But you've also done some work in the last week or two kind of in the international domain. What's the state of all that? What's the health and status of that? And any closing remarks you would make to us from the chair you enjoy?
So I'm really privileged to work for an organisation that has huge strength in its international partnerships. And so as I travel and catch up with colleagues in Europe or in the Far East or in the Five Eyes community, I am really blessed with professional, passionate exchanges of people really deeply committed to keeping their communities, their citizens, their businesses, their economies safe, and to seeing that they do that stronger in partnership That's been a huge theme of every session that I've been lucky enough to be part of here, that sense of we are stronger together, and let's build that alliance and let's work really well together. I was on Friday, just before travelling here, I joined Australian and New Zealand colleagues in commemorating Anzac Day. So, 110 years since they fought to defend the Allies in Gallipoli in the First World War, and then, of course, huge losses that they incurred in the Second World War. And as I go back to the UK next week, we will be, I'll be part of the sort of Victory in Europe celebrations, again, that just show what happens when we work together. And so that sense of history, coupled with how people are feeling today, just gives me real confidence, Chris, that internationally those partnerships are really strong. And I'm very lucky to benefit from that in my organisation's work.
May it be ever thus. So I know we've come to the close of time, but I'll use a British word to characterize what I think you've done for the last 15 minutes. It's been brilliant. Thank you. And thank you so much
Chris.
for your contribution to all of this.
Well,
Ladies and gentlemen, if you please offer a round of applause for Director Anne Keith.